Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into one of the most fascinating and complex figures in all of Japanese mythology, the deity known as Susanoo no Mikoto. Written in Japanese as Susanoo no Mikoto, he is commonly known simply as Susanoo. He is perhaps the most debated divine figure in the Japanese mythological tradition.
That's absolutely right. What makes Susanoo so endlessly fascinating is his fundamental duality. He is simultaneously a destructive, raging deity and a heroic culture bringer. He wreaks havoc in the heavenly realm, yet he also slays a monstrous eight-headed serpent and saves a maiden. From ancient court rituals to modern academic scholarship, Susanoo has generated an extraordinary range of interpretations over more than 13 centuries.
Let's begin at the very beginning with the primary sources. The oldest account of Susanoo comes from the Kojiki, which translates as Records of Ancient Matters, compiled in the year 712. The Kojiki is Japan's oldest surviving historical text. Can you walk us through the birth narrative?
Certainly. According to the Kojiki, the story begins with the god Izanagi no Mikoto. Izanagi had journeyed to the underworld, known as Yomi no Kuni, the land of the dead, to retrieve his deceased wife Izanami no Mikoto. But what he found there horrified him. Izanami had already begun to decay. Izanagi fled in terror. After escaping from the underworld, he performed a purification ritual called misogi at a place called Awagihara in Hyuga in the Tsukushi region.
And it was during this purification ritual that the three most important deities were born, correct?
Exactly. These three are called the Mihashira no Uzunomiko, or the three precious children. When Izanagi washed his left eye, the sun goddess Amaterasu Omikami was born. When he washed his right eye, the moon deity Tsukuyomi no Mikoto was born. And when he washed his nose, Takeyaya Susanoo no Mikoto was born. The scholar Yamada A., in his doctoral dissertation at Meiji University in 2001, analyzed the symbolic significance of this birth from the nose and explored the ancient meaning of weeping in early Japanese culture.
The fact that Susanoo was born from the nose rather than from the eyes, like his siblings, becomes very important in later interpretations, doesn't it?
It does indeed, and we'll come back to that when we discuss the Edo period scholar Motoori Norinaga. But for now, let's continue with the myth. Izanagi assigned each of the three a domain to rule. Amaterasu was given Takamagahara, the plane of high heaven. Tsukuzomi was given the realm of the night, and Susanoo was given the sea, called Unabara.
But Susanoo didn't accept this assignment, did he?
No, Susanoo refused his divine commission entirely. Instead, he wept and raged, saying he wanted to go to Nenokuni, the land of roots, also called the underworld, where his deceased mother Izanami dwelt. The Kojiki describes his weeping as so extreme that his beard grew down to his chest, the mountains withered, the rivers and seas dried up, and malevolent spirits multiplied everywhere. The great scholar Saigo Nobutsuna analyzed this passage in his monumental work Kojiki Chushaku, or Annotations on the Kojiki, published by Heibon Sha between 1975 and 1989. Saigo interpreted this scene through the lens of a structural opposition between order and chaos.
Eventually, Susanoo decides to go up to Takamagahara to say farewell to his sister Amaterasu. This triggers one of the most dramatic sequences in all of Japanese mythology.
It's a remarkable episode. Amaterasu is suspicious of her brother's intentions and arms herself. Susanoo proposes a divination ritual called an uke, a kind of sacred oath or vow to prove his sincerity. Each deity transforms objects belonging to the other into new beings. From Susanoo's 10-span sword, called the Totsuka no Tsurugi, three female deities are born. These are the Munakata Sanjoshin, the three goddesses of Munakata. From Amaterasu's Magatama jewels, 5 male deities are born.
And Susanoo claims victory, saying his pure heart has been proven.
Yes, but immediately afterward, Susanoo commits a series of outrages in Takamagahara that are classified as amatsutsumi, or heavenly offenses. These are very specific categories of transgression in the Shinto purification tradition. First, he destroyed the ridges between the sacred rice paddies tended by Amaterasu and filled in the irrigation ditches. Second, he defecated in the hall where the Nina Messai, the harvest Thanksgiving ceremony, was being performed. This act is called kusohei, literally excrement door. Third, and most shockingly, he flayed a heavenly piebald horse called the Amano Fuchikoma alive and backwards, then hurled the carcass through the roof of the sacred weaving hall. A weaving maiden called Hata Orime was so startled that she struck herself with the weaving shuttle and died.
This is a crucial turning point in the mythology, isn't it? Because this event causes Amaterasu to retreat into the Ama no Iwato, the heavenly rock cave, plunging both Takamagahara and the earthly realm, called Ashihira no Nakatsukuni, into total darkness.
Precisely. The scholar Yoshimura Teiji, in his 1977 work on Susanoo's dragon slaying, argued that there are actually two distinct Susanos in the mythology. The Susanoo of Takamagahara, who functions as an agricultural destroyer and is essentially a personification of the typhoon, and the Susanoo of Izumo, who is a heroic figure. This duality is one of the central puzzles of Susanoo scholarship.
What happens to Susanoo after the darkness episode?
The 8 million deities, the Yayorozu no Kami, punish Susanoo severely. They cut his beard, pull out his fingernails and toenails, impose a fine called Chikura no Okido, meaning 1,000 tables of offerings, and finally carry out what is called Kamuyarai, the divine expulsion. Susanoo is banished from Takamagahara forever.
And this brings us to what is perhaps the most beloved episode in all of Japanese mythology, the slaying of the eight-headed serpent. Tell us about Susanoo's descent to Izumo.
After his banishment, Susanoo descends to a place called Torikami at the headwaters of the Hi River, written in the Kojiki as the Hi no Kawa, in the province of Izumo in western Japan. He notices chopsticks floating down the river, which tells him that people live upstream. Following the river, he discovers an elderly couple weeping with their young daughter. The old man identifies himself as Ashinazuchi and his wife as Teinazuchi. They are children of the mountain god Oya Matsumi no Kami. Their daughter is Kushi Nadahime, also called Kushi Inadahime.
And the reason they're weeping is the terrifying serpent.
Yes, the couple explains that they originally had 8 daughters, but every year a monstrous serpent arrives from the land of Koshi, and each year it devours one daughter. Now only Kushi Nadahime remains, and the serpent is due to come again.
The Kojiki's description of this creature is incredibly vivid, isn't it?
Extraordinarily so. The creature is called Yamata no Orochi, the 8-forked serpent. The Kojiki describes it as having 8 heads and 8 tails. Its eyes are red like the akakagachi, the winter cherry plant. Its single body stretches across 8 valleys and 8 mountain peaks. Moss and great trees, cypress and cedar, grow upon its back, and its belly is perpetually raw and bleeding with blood. The scholar Taniguchi Masahiro published an important study in 2017 in the journal Jodai Bungaku Kenkyu Ronshu, examining the geographical understanding of the myth, particularly debating whether Koshi refers to the Hokuriku region on the Sea of Japan coast or to a place within Izumo itself.
So Susanoo agrees to slay the serpent. What is his plan?
Susanoo agrees to defeat the Yamata no Orochi on the condition that Kushi Nadahime become his wife. First, he transforms Kushi Nadahime into a comb called a Yutsu Tsumagushi, a magical fine-toothed comb, and places it in his own hair for safekeeping. Then he instructs the old couple to build a fence with 8 gates, and at each gate they place a tub filled with an exceptionally potent sake called Yashiyori no Sake, which means 8 times brewed sake.
And the serpent takes the bait.
It does. The Yamata no Orochi arrives, and each of its 8 heads plunges into a tub of sake and drinks deeply. The serpent becomes utterly intoxicated and falls asleep. Susanoo then attacks, hacking the creature to pieces with his Totsuka no Tsurugi, his 10-span sword. When he cuts through the middle tail, his blade chips. Investigating, he discovers inside the tail a magnificent sword. This sword is the Ama no Murakumo no Tsurugi, meaning Sword of the Gathering Clouds of Heaven, which later becomes known as the Kusanagi no Tsurugi. Susanoo presents this sword to Amaterasu as an offering. This becomes one of the Sanshu no Jingi, the 3 sacred treasures of the Japanese imperial line, and the act itself is interpreted as a symbolic gesture of reconciliation with heaven.
The scholar Miura Sukiyuki has a very interesting interpretation of this entire episode, doesn't he?
He does. Miura reads the myth as a conflict between culture, represented by Susanoo, and nature, represented by the serpent as a river deity. He argues that Kushi Nadahime, whose name contains the element inada, meaning rice paddy, symbolizes cultivated land threatened by floods. The serpent, then, represents the destructive flooding of the Hi River.
After slaying the serpent, Susanoo composes what is traditionally regarded as the very first Japanese poem. Can you tell us about that?
After the battle, Susanoo searches for a place to build a home. He arrives at a place called Suga and declares, "Coming to this place, my heart feels refreshed," using the word suga-sugashi. He builds a palace there and composes this poem. Yakumo tatsu, izumo yaegaki, tsumagomi ni, yaegaki tsukuru, sono yaegaki yo. This translates roughly as, "Many clouds rise. The clouds form a manifold fence of Izumo, in which to enfold my new bride. What a fine manifold fence." This is celebrated as the origin of waka poetry, the traditional Japanese poetic form, and it represents Susanoo's complete transformation from a destroyer into a creator of civilization and beauty.
The story of Susanoo doesn't end there, though. There is another major episode set in Nen no Katasukuni, the land of roots.
That's right. In this final act, Susanoo is living in the underworld with his daughter Suseribime, a young deity named Owanamuchi no Kami, who will later become the Great Okunushi, or Master of the Great Land, arrives fleeing persecution from his brothers. Susanoo scornfully calls him Ashihara no Shiko, a derogatory nickname meaning ugly male of the reed plain, and subjects him to a series of lethal trials. He is placed in a room full of snakes, then a room full of centipedes and wasps, then sent into a field that Susanoo sets ablaze. But each time, Suseribime secretly provides magical scarves called hire and wisdom to help him survive.
In the end, Owanamuchi steals Susanoo's treasures and escapes with Suseribime.
Yes, he takes the Ikutachi, the life-giving sword, the Ikuyumiya, the life-giving bow and arrows, and the Ame no Norigoto, the heavenly-speaking lute. He flees with Suseribime on his back. Susanoo chases them all the way to Yomotsu Hirasaka, the boundary between the worlds. But then, in a remarkable reversal, Susanoo gives a paradoxical blessing. He tells Owanamuchi, "Take those weapons, defeat your brothers, become Okuninushi, take Suseribime as your chief wife, and build a great palace." Scholars at Kokugakuen University interpret this entire sequence as a tsukagire, an initiation rite in which Susanoo is testing whether Owanamuchi is worthy to inherit the mission of building the earthly nation.
Now, the Kojiki is not the only ancient source for the Susanoo myths. Let's turn to the Nihon Shoki, also known as the Nihongi, the Chronicles of Japan, completed in the year 720.
The Nihon Shoki takes a fundamentally different approach. While it has a main narrative, it also preserves multiple variant accounts called isho, meaning alternative versions. For the Susanoo mythology alone, there are approximately 22 different traditions preserved. The birth of the three noble children has a main text and 11 variants. The oath ritual has 4 versions, the heavenly outrages have 4 versions, and the banishment and serpent slaying have 6 versions.
That is a strikingly different method of recording mythology compared to the Kojiki.
It is, and it's unique to the Jindai chapters, the Age of the Gods sections, which comprise the first 2 books of the Nihon Shoki. Chinese dynastic histories, which were the model for the Nihon Shoki, use a unified narrative approach. The scholar Watanabe Takashi at Kokugakuen University described this method as an expression of the richness and depth of the nation called Japan.
What are some of the key differences between the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki accounts?
There are several crucial differences. First, regarding the birth narrative, in the Nihon Shoki's main text, the 3 noble children are born from the sexual union of both Izanagi and Izanami. There is no death of Izanami, no underworld visit, no purification ritual. This is completely different from the Kojiki. Second, regarding Susanoo's character, Taniguchi Masahiro published an important study in 2020 in the Kokugakuen Zashi, the Kokugakuen University Journal, demonstrating that the Nihon Shoki explicitly describes Susanoo as having Jashin, an evil heart, which is far more damning than the Kojiki's more ambiguous portrayal.
There's also a very important variant in the Nihon Shoki about Susanoo traveling to the Korean peninsula, isn't there?
Yes, this is one of the most debated passages in all of early Japanese literature. In the 4th variant, or Isho number 4, of the 8th section, Susanoo descends first to the land of Shiragi, the ancient kingdom of Silla in Korea, together with his son Isotakeru no Kami, also called Itakeru. They arrive at a place called Soshimori, but Susanoo says he doesn't want to stay there, builds a boat from clay, and crosses the sea to Mount Torikami in Izumo.
This same variant also describes Susanoo as a culture hero who creates different types of trees from his own body hair. His beard becomes Japanese cedar, called sugi. His chest hair becomes Japanese cypress, called hinoki. His body hair becomes podocarpus, called maki. And his eyebrows become camphor, called kusu. Each tree is assigned a practical use, making Susanoo a deity of forestry and planting.
The scholar Seki Yuji has an interesting theory about why the two texts differ so much in their treatment of Susanoo.
Yes, Seki, in his 2023 book published by Shinshosha, argued that the different attitudes toward Susanoo in the Kochiki and Nihon Shoki reflect the political influence of the Fujiwara clan on the compilation process. According to this view, the Nihon Shoki's more negative portrayal was deliberately crafted to subordinate Izumo-related traditions to the Yamato imperial lineage.
Let's move beyond the two main chronicles now and look at other ancient sources. The regional gazetteers, the Fudoki, present a rather different picture of Susanoo, don't they?
They present a dramatically different picture. The Izumo no Kuni Fudoki, compiled in 733, is especially significant. The great folklorist Matsumura Takeo argued that the Fudoki accurately preserves Susanoo's original character as a peaceful and simple rice paddy deity. In the Fudoki, there is no mention of the rampage in Takamagahara, and there is no eight-headed serpent. Instead, Susanoo appears as a benevolent agricultural god who named local places. For instance, the Susa district is said to have been named when Susanoo declared, "This country is small, but it is a good land. I shall attach my name not to stones or trees, but to this land itself." Matsumura believed the negative aspects of Susanoo's character were deliberately added during the compilation of the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki.
There is also an extremely important legend preserved in the Bingo no Kuni Fudoki, the Somen Shorai legend. Can you tell us about that?
Now, this legend is crucial for understanding the later development of Susanoo worship. A deity called Muto no Kami, the god of Muto, travels from the northern sea to court the daughter of a deity of the southern sea. Along the way, he asks a wealthy man named Kotan Shurai for lodging, but is refused. The poor elder brother, Somen Shurai, welcomes him warmly. Years later, the deity returns, gives Somen Shurai's daughter a magical ring made of kaya grass called a chino-wa, a ring of miscanthus, and that very night destroys the entire household of the wealthy brother. The deity then reveals himself to be Haya Susanoo no Kami, in other words, Susanoo. He promises that anyone who wears the grass ring and identifies themselves as a descendant of Somen Shurai will be protected from plague. This legend became the foundation of the Gion faith and is still practiced today in shrines across Japan as the Chino-wa Kuguri purification ceremony, where worshippers walk through large rings made of woven grass.
Now, let's talk about how Susanoo was understood in the ritual and liturgical traditions. What about the Engi-shiki?
The Engi-shiki, compiled in 927, contains two important ritual texts. The Izumo no Kuni no Miyatsuko Kamuyogoto, the divine congratulatory words of the Izumo provincial governor, traces the genealogy from Susanoo through to Okuninushi, preserving an Izumo-centered mythological worldview. The Uharai no Kotoba, the Great Purification Liturgy, lists the specific transgressions Susanoo committed in Takamagahara as the definitive catalog of Amatsutsumi, heavenly offenses: breaking the ridges, called ahanachi, filling in ditches, called mizo-ume, destroying sluice gates, called hihanachi, double planting, called shikimaki, erecting stakes in fields, called kushisashi, backward flaying, called ikihagi, and the excrement door, called kusoe. These categories became fixed in Shinto ritual practice and permanently established the negative dimension of Susanoo's character in the liturgical context.
Now, let's discuss one of the most important developments in the medieval period, the identification of Susanoo with the Buddhist deity Gozu Tenno, the ox-headed heavenly king.
This is a fascinating chapter. During the medieval period, under the system called Shinbutsu Shugo, the syncretism of Shinto deities and Buddhist figures, Susanoo became identified with Gozu Tenno. This identification was based on the Honji Suijaku doctrine, which held that Buddhist deities were the original ground, or Honji, while Shinto deities were their manifest traces, or Suijaku, in the Japanese context. Gozu Tenno's Honji, or original Buddhist form, was identified as Yakushi Nyorai, the medicine Buddha. As a deity who both caused and cured epidemics, Gozu Tenno became the central figure of the Gion cult, centered on the Gion Sha, now known as Yasaka Jinja, Yasaka Shrine in Kyoto. The scholar Gon Dongu, in his 2013 study published by Hozokan, traced this transformation from the classical texts through the medieval period in detail.
It's remarkable how far Susanoo had traveled from his origins by this point, from a storm deity in the ancient chronicles to an epidemic god merged with an imported Buddhist deity.
And the great Yoshida school theologian Yoshida Kanetomo, who lived from 1435 to 1511, developed his own system called Yoshida Shinto, which reversed the Honji Suijaku formula. He argued that Shinto was the root, the tree trunk, while Buddhism and Confucianism were merely the branches, leaves, flowers, and fruit. This doctrine, called Konpon Shiyo Kajitsu Setsu, planted the seeds for the later Shinto purification movement.
Let's quickly survey the major Susanoo shrines because they reveal the geographic spread of his worship.
The most important is Susajinja in Izumo, which claims to be the only shrine enshrining the actual spirit of Susanoo. The priestly families, the Susa and Inada clans, claim descent from Susanoo through his son Yashimaji-numi no Kami. Yasaka Jinja in Kyoto was originally the Gion-sha, enshrining Gozu Tenno, and was the origin of the Gion Matsuri, Kyoto's famous festival, which began in the year 869 as a Goryoe, a ceremony to pacify angry spirits during an epidemic. Hikawa Jinja in Saitama is said to have been founded when the Musashi no Kuni no Miyatsuko, the provincial governor of Musashi, migrated from Izumo and brought Susanoo worship with him. The shrine's name is even said to derive from the Hi River in Izumo. And Tsushima Jinja in Aichi is the head of approximately 3,000 Tsushima shrines nationwide. Its festival, the Owari Tsushima Tenno Matsuri, is registered as a UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage.
Now let's trace the history of how scholars have interpreted Susanoo across the centuries. The Edo period Kokugaku, or national learning, scholars had a particularly strong impact.
The most influential was Motoori Norinaga, who lived from 1730 to 1801. His masterwork, the Kojiki Den, a commentary on the Kojiki running to 44 volumes and completed in 1798, defined Susanoo unequivocally as an akushin, an evil deity. Motoori developed an elaborate explanation for this. He argued that when Izanagi returned from the underworld and performed the purification ritual, the pollution, the kegare, from every part of his body was washed away, except from the nose. According to Motoori, the stench from the nose had penetrated too deeply to be diminished, and therefore the deity born from the nose, Susanoo, retained this pollution. Motoori connected this to the Magatsuhi no Kami, the deity of calamity born during the purification, and stressed the contrast with the pure Amaterasu and Tsukuyomi.
Motoori's approach was also methodologically groundbreaking, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Motoori rejected all Buddhist interpretations and Chinese philosophical frameworks, what he called kara gokoro, the Chinese mindset. He insisted on reading the Kojiki as a pure expression of the Japanese spirit, what he termed Yamato Gokoro. This was pioneering textual criticism, though some contemporaries, like Fujitani Mitsue, in his work Kojiki To, criticized aspects of Motoori's interpretation as irrational.
And his student Hirata Atsutane?
Hirata Atsutane, who lived from 1776 to 1843, developed what is called Fukko Shinto, Restoration Shinto. He authored works like the Koshiden and Koshi Seibun, but he departed significantly from Motoori's strict textual approach. Hirata incorporated ideas from Taoism and even Christianity, the latter acquired through Rangaku, or Dutch learning, developing an elaborate afterlife theology. The translator Donald Philippi noted that both Motoori and Hirata claimed the sequence of events in the Susanoo myth was scrambled, that the outrages should have come before the oath ritual, but Philippi criticized this as textually unsupportable.
The Meiji era brought the most radical political transformation of Susanoo worship. What happened?
The single most transformative event was the Shinbutsu Bunri Rei, the edict separating Shinto and Buddhism, issued in 1868 at the start of the Meiji Restoration. The government specifically cited the worship of Gozu Tenno as a prime example of the distortion of Shinto. Every single Gozu Tenno shrine and Gionsha across the entire country was forced to change its enshrined deity from Gozu Tenno to Susanoo. The Gionsha became Yasaka Jinja. the Tsushima Godzu Tennosha became Tsushima Jinja. Centuries of syncretic tradition were dismantled virtually overnight.
And under state Shinto, Susanoo was given a very specific political role.
He was repositioned as the subordinate younger brother of Amaterasu, whose ultimate submission to his sister reinforced the sacredness of the imperial line. The Tokyo Imperial University scholar Shiratori Kurakichi promoted the Nikkan Dosoron, the common ancestry of Japan and Korea theory, which held that the Japanese were descendants of Amaterasu, while Koreans were descendants of Susanoo. This was instrumentalized to justify colonial rule over Korea. In 1919, a shrine called Ebara Jinja was even built on the Korean peninsula at the supposed site of Susanoo's descent at Soshimori. It was removed after 1945.
The post-war period brought a complete reversal in scholarly approaches.
The single most influential post-war scholar was Tsuda Sokichi, who lived from 1873 to 1961. Tsuda argued that the myths recorded in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki were not historical facts, but propaganda myths fabricated to legitimize imperial rule. He interpreted Amaterasu as a symbol of the emperor, and Susanoo as a symbol of forces that had rebelled against the imperial household.
The folklorist Matsumura Takeo also made important contributions.
Yes, Matsumura, in his monumental 4-volume Nihon Shinwa no Kenkyu, Studies in Japanese Mythology, published between 1954 and 1958, strongly criticized the use of mythology as war propaganda under state Shinto. He distinguished between what he called the imperial court-level myths and more fundamental folk-level myths. He championed the Izumo no Kuni Fudoki as preserving Susanoo's original peaceful character as a rice paddy god.
Let's talk about the comparative mythologists who brought an international perspective to Susanoo studies.
The pioneering figure was Obayashi Tario, who lived from 1929 to 2001. In his 1961 work, Nihon Shinwa no Kigen, The Origins of Japanese Mythology, he argued that the myth of the three noble children derived from a Southeast Asian myth of three sibling deities representing the sun, moon, and a dark star. In this framework, Susanoo corresponds to the dark star who plays an antagonistic role, paralleling figures like Rahu and Ketu in Hindu mythology. Another major figure, Matsumae Takeshi, who lived from 1922 to 2002, proposed that Susanoo was originally a patron deity of seafarers, and that his worship originated not in Izumo, but in Kinokuni, present-day Wakayama Prefecture.
More recently, scholars like Amelia Gadelova and David Weiss have brought new perspectives.
Gadelova, in a 2000 study, identified Susanoo's original character as a rain deity, which explains both his positive and negative aspects. Beneficial rain for agriculture, but also destructive floods and drought. Weiss, in his 2022 book published by Bloomsbury, examined how the Susanoo myth has functioned in Japan's intellectual history as a way of representing the relationship with Korea. He argues that the ambiguous, liminal position that Susanoo occupies in relation to Amaterasu parallels the position Korea occupies in relation to Japan in the Japanese cultural imagination.
The scholar Isome Junichi has proposed yet another approach.
Isome advocates for what he calls a meta-historical approach. Rather than trying to recover the original meaning of the Susanoo myths, he studies the history of interpretation itself. His question is not, what did Susanoo originally mean, but rather, how have different eras and different interpreters understood and used Susanoo?
Now let's turn to the academic interpretations of the Yamata no Orochi slaying myth specifically. There are several major schools of thought.
The first is the mythological typology approach. The serpent-slaying narrative belongs to what folklorists classify as the Perseus-Andromeda type. A hero defeats a monster and rescues a maiden who was to be sacrificed. In terms of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey framework, it maps perfectly. The banishment is the departure, the serpent slaying is the initiation, and the marriage is the return. The scholar Calvert Watkins, in his 1995 book, How to Kill a Dragon, analyzed dragon-slaying motifs across the Indo-European poetic tradition and noted potential comparisons with Japanese mythology.
What about the historical interpretations?
There are two major ones. The first is the Yamato-Izumo power relations theory, which sees the serpent slaying as a symbolic precursor to the Kuniyuzuri, the transfer of the land myth, in which Izumo power is subordinated to Yamato.
The presentation of the Kusanagi no Tsurugi to Amaterasu symbolizes this transfer of authority. The origin of the serpent from Koshi may reflect conflicts with the Koshi region, the ancient province corresponding to the Hokuriku area on the Sea of Japan coast.
And then there's the iron smelting theory, which is particularly popular.
This is known as the Tatara connection theory. Tatara is the traditional Japanese iron smelting method, and the headwaters of the Hi River and Oku-Izumo are one of the most important historical centers of Tatara iron production in all of Japan. Proponents of this theory note that the serpent's red eyes, described as like akakagachi, reflect the red-lit eyes of metalworkers peering into the furnace. The serpent's perpetually bleeding belly represents molten iron and iron slag, called keta. The sword that emerges from the tail symbolizes the product of smelting. The trees growing on the serpent's back represent the enormous consumption of charcoal wood needed for the smelting process. And certain variant names for the sword, which contain the character kata, meaning Korea or continental, suggest the importation of metallurgical technology from the Asian mainland. The philosopher Umehara Takeshi interpreted the serpent as an invading force from Koshi that controlled iron and jade resources.
What about the flood control theory?
The flood control, or Chisui theory, interprets the serpent as the Hi River itself. The 8 heads and tails represent tributaries and distributaries. The annual sacrifice of a maiden represents the recurrence of flood damage each year. Kushinada Hime, whose name literally means wondrous rice paddy princess, symbolizes the rice fields threatened by flooding. The Hi River was historically notorious for severe flooding. Its course was even artificially redirected in 1639 to flow into Lake Shinji. Before that, its scallop-shaped sandbars were said to resemble the body of a serpent. The physicist Terada Torihiko suggested the description might even evoke the imagery of a lava flow. There are also significant folkloristic interpretations involving serpent worship.
The scholar Yoshino Hiroko, in her book Yama no Kami, The Mountain God, published in the Kodansha Gakujutsu Bunko series, conducted a comprehensive study of snake symbolism in Japanese culture. She argued that snakes, because they shed their skin, are symbols of death and rebirth, and are connected to the origins of purification ritual. She further proposed that the word kagami, meaning mirror, derives from kaka, an ancient word for snake, plus me, meaning eye. She suggested that the shimenawa, the sacred rope seen at Shinto shrines, represents 2 snakes in the act of mating, and that kagami mochi, the stacked rice cakes used in New Year celebrations, represent a coiled snake body. Even the suffix chi in the word orochi is the same chi found in ikazuchi, meaning thunder, a suffix that denotes spiritual power.
The agricultural ritual interpretation is closely related.
Indeed, Kushinada Hime embodies the rice field deity. The motif of human sacrifice reflects prayers for agricultural fertility. The serpent, as a water deity, controls irrigation. The marriage between the hero and the maiden represents a hieros gamos, a sacred union of water and fertility. And the harvest time setting of the myth suggests an origin in calendrical agricultural rites. Related serpent and water deity traditions appear throughout Japan, including the offerings of sea snakes, called ryuja, at the Sada Jinja during the Kamiyarisai festival, the serpent deity Omononushi at Omiwa Jinja, and the horned serpent deity Yato no Kami in the Hitachi no Kuni Fudoki.
The comparative mythology dimension is also very rich.
Extremely so. Indo-European parallels include the Greek myth of Perseus and Andromeda, the Vedic myth of Indra slaying the serpent Vritra, with Indra drinking the sacred Soma drink to gain power, remarkably parallel to the Saki motif, the Norse myth of Thor battling the world serpent Jormungandr, the legend of St. George and the Dragon, and the Hittite myth of Iluyanka, which is the oldest Iron Age serpent-slaying myth known. In East Asian parallels, we find the Chinese stories of the Jiaolong, a malevolent river dragon, and the myth of King Yu slaying the 9-headed serpent Xiangliu. There is also the Korean tale of Gyodaji in the Samguk Yusa, the memorabilia of the 3 kingdoms, which the scholar Gondongu identified as structurally similar to the Yamatano Orochi myth.
The scholar Yoshida Atsuhiko took a particularly influential approach using the trifunctional hypothesis.
Yes, Yoshida Atsuhiko studied in Paris under the great French comparative mythologist Georges Dumézil, who developed the theory that Indo-European societies organized their mythology around 3 functions: sovereignty, the warrior function, and production or fertility.
In his 1974 book published by Misuzu Shobo, Yoshida applied this framework to Japanese mythology. He argued that the Sanshu no Jinji, the three sacred treasures of the mirror, the sword, and the jewel, correspond to the three functions of sovereignty, warfare, and fertility, respectively. He also suggested that three noble children, Amaterasu, Susanoo, and Tsukuyomi, each represent one function. However, Dumezil himself was cautious about applying his framework to Japan, suggesting that any parallel might be explained through contact via the Scythian peoples of Central Asia rather than direct inheritance. Yoshida and Obayashi Tario later co-authored a more detailed comparative study called Tsurugi no Kami, Tsurugi no Eiyu, the god of the sword, the hero of the sword.
There's also the structuralist approach, following Claude Lévi-Strauss.
The structuralist analysis extracts a series of binary oppositions, heaven, represented by Takamagahara, versus earth, represented by Izumo, order, embodied by Amaterasu, versus chaos, embodied by the pre-transformation Susanoo, culture, represented by the arts of sake brewing and sword-making, versus nature, the serpent, life, represented by Kushinada Hime, versus death, the sacrifice, male versus female. Susanoo's transformation arc, from destroyer to exile to hero to ancestor deity, and the parallel transformation of Kushinada Hime, from maiden to comb to wife, symbolize the domestication of natural forces by culture. Key Japanese structuralist analyses include the works of Saigo Nobutsuna, Matsumaya Takeshi, Fujii Nobuo, and Sugita Masaki.
Are there any criticisms of these various interpretive approaches?
Certainly. The Tatara iron smelting theory has been criticized on the grounds that large-scale Tatara production may postdate the formation of the myth. The flood control theory has been questioned for its lack of direct textual evidence. The trifunctional theory has been criticized for being potentially too universal a pattern to prove specifically Indo-European transmission. The scholar Konoichi Takamitsu and others have argued that the Nihon Shoki's variant traditions deserve more attention than they traditionally receive, and they have criticized the tendency to privilege the Kojiki as the primary source.
What about the archaeological evidence? Does it support the mythology?
The archaeological discoveries in the Izumo region have been nothing short of extraordinary. In 1984, the Kujendani site yielded an astonishing 358 bronze swords, the largest cache of ancient bronze weapons ever found in Japan. In 1996, the nearby Kamo Iwakura site produced 39 bronze bells called dotaku. And in the year 2000, excavations at Izumo Taisha, the grand shrine of Izumo, revealed the remains of enormous pillars, the Shin no Mihashira, the heart pillars, suggesting the ancient shrine was far larger and taller than previously believed. The distribution of Yosumi Toshutsukata Funkyubo, square burial mounds with protruding corners unique to the region, further confirms Izumo as a significant political entity in ancient Japan. All of this provides material support for the idea that the Izumo myths reflect a real and powerful culture.
Let's bring everything together now with the current state of Susanoo research.
The cutting edge of the field includes several exciting directions. There is quantitative comparative mythology, pioneered by David Weiss in 2017, which uses statistical methods to trace the historical transmission of mythological motifs. There is linguistic phylogenetic analysis of myth, which borrows methods from evolutionary biology to reconstruct the family trees of narrative traditions. There is a growing integration of folkloristic field research with textual criticism, and there is the increasing use of archaeological evidence to ground mythological analysis in material reality.
Let's close with a reflection on what makes Susanoo so enduring as a subject of study.
What is truly remarkable about Susanoo is that the history of his interpretation is itself a mirror of Japanese intellectual history. In the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, he embodies the tension between heaven and earth, between imperial authority and local power. In the Fudoki, he is a gentle agricultural god. In the medieval period, he becomes a plague deity fused with a Buddhist figure from India. The Kokugaku scholars defined him as an evil god. Under state Shinto, he was used to justify colonialism. In the post-war period, comparative mythologists connected him to worldwide patterns of heroic narrative. And today, scholars approach him through gender studies, post-colonial theory, and the meta-historical analysis of interpretation itself.
He embodies destruction and creation, chaos and order, death and rebirth, all at once.
Precisely.
That fundamental ambiguity, that refusal to be pinned down to a single meaning, is exactly what has kept Susanoo at the center of Japanese mythological scholarship for over 1,300 years. He is not just a character in an ancient story. He is a lens through which we can see how each era of Japanese civilization has understood itself. The Yamatano Orochi serpent slaying myth, in particular, sits at the intersection of universal heroic narrative and deeply specific Japanese cultural context. Iron smelting, flood management, rice agriculture, serpent worship, the Izumo-Yamato power dynamic. It can be read as a folktale, as a ritual text, as political propaganda, as a nature myth, or as a comparative archetype. That richness of interpretive possibility is what makes Susanoo not just a deity from the past, but a living subject of inquiry for the future.
Thank you so much for this incredibly detailed exploration. For listeners who want to dive deeper, the key primary sources are the Kojiki of 712, the Nihon Shoki of 720, and the Izumo no Kuni Fudoki of 733. Major scholarly works include Matsumura Takeo's Studies in Japanese Mythology, Obayashi Taryo's Origins of Japanese Mythology, Yoshida Atsuhiko's Greek Mythology and Japanese Mythology, and David Weiss's The God Susanoo and Korea in Japan's Cultural Memory. The English translations of the primary sources by Donald Philippi and W.G. Aston remain invaluable for readers who do not read classical Japanese.
And I think the most important takeaway for our listeners is this. The study of Susanoo is not just the study of an ancient myth. It is the study of how culture creates meaning, how power shapes narrative, and how a single figure can contain within himself the entire spectrum of human experience, from the darkest destruction to the most radiant creation.
That is a wonderful note to end on. Thank you all for listening.